Picture this. You're standing on the deck of a wooden ship in 1450. There's no land in sight, just endless ocean in every direction, no GPS, no compass that really works, no maps worth trusting. One wrong turn and you're lost forever, swallowed by the Atlantic. But then a Portuguese sailor pulls out a strange brass instrument, points it at the sun, and suddenly he knows exactly where he is. This single tool changed everything. It turned Portugal from a tiny kingdom on Europe's edge into the greatest naval power on Earth. Today, I'm going to show you how the Astrolabe didn't just help Portugal navigate, it helped them conquer the world. Before we dive into this incredible story, if you love history that actually matters, the kind that changed the course of humanity, hit that subscribe button and smash the like. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Let me take you back to the early 1400s. If you lived in Europe during this time, the ocean was basically the edge of the world. Sure, people had been sailing for thousands of years, but there was a catch. They never went far from the coast. Mediterranean sailors hugged the shoreline like their lives depended on it. Because guess what? Their lives did depend on it. Navigation back then was primitive, almost laughably simple by our standards. Sailors used a technique called cabotage, which is just a fancy word for keep the land in sight at all times. You'd sail from port to port, landmark to landmark, using coastal features to guide you. See that mountain? Sail toward it. See that lighthouse? Turn left. It worked fine for short distances, but it had a massive limitation. You could never venture into the open ocean. Why? Because once you lost sight of land, you were essentially blind. You had no reliable way to know where you were, which direction you were heading, or how to get back home. The magnetic compass had been introduced to Europe from China, but it was unreliable and poorly understood. It pointed north, sure, but that only gave you direction, not position. You could be sailing north perfectly well and still have no idea if you were off the coast of Ireland or heading straight for the Arctic. And then there were the legends. Medieval Europeans believed the ocean was filled with monsters, boiling seas, and zones where the sun would literally burn you alive if you sailed too far south. Maps from this era show sea serpents and dragons in the Atlantic, with ominous warnings written in Latin, "Here be monsters." Sailors genuinely believed that if you sailed too far west, you'd fall off the edge of the world, or that the waters near the equator would cook you in your own ship. But the real terror wasn't mythological, it was practical. Ships that ventured too far from land often never returned. They'd run out of supplies, get lost in storms, or simply drift endlessly until everyone on board died of thirst or starvation. There are countless stories of ghost ships found floating empty in the Atlantic, their crews vanished, their fate unknown. This wasn't fantasy. This was reality. For Portugal, this was a massive problem. See, Portugal sits on the western edge of Europe, facing the Atlantic. They're blocked on one side by Spain and surrounded by ocean on the other. If they wanted to grow, to trade, to compete with the powerful Italian city-states that dominated Mediterranean commerce, they had to go out there into that terrifying open water. And that meant solving the most fundamental problem in human exploration. How do you know where you are when you can't see anything but water? Now here's where things get interesting. The astrolabe wasn't invented by the Portuguese. In fact, it wasn't even a new invention in the 1400s. The astrolabe had been around for over 1,000 years, used by ancient Greek astronomers and later perfected by Islamic scholars during the Golden Age of Islam. The original astrolabe was a sophisticated astronomical instrument used on land to measure the positions of stars and planets, calculate time, and even determine the direction of Mecca for prayers. It was a marvel of medieval engineering, a brass disc covered in intricate engravings with movable parts that could simulate the movement of celestial bodies. Islamic astronomers in places like Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba had been using astrolabes for centuries to advance their understanding of the cosmos. But here's the thing. Land-based astrolabes were complex, delicate, and totally impractical for use on a rocking, swaying ship in the middle of the ocean. You needed something simpler, more rugged, something that could survive saltwater, storms, and the constant motion of the waves. Enter the Portuguese. They didn't invent the astrolabe, but they revolutionized it. Portuguese navigators, working with astronomers, mathematicians, and instrument makers, developed what we now call the mariner's astrolabe. This was a stripped-down, simplified version designed specifically for nautical use. The mariner's astrolabe was heavy, often made of solid brass weighing several pounds, so it wouldn't blow around in the wind. It had large, easy-to-read markings, so sailors with cold, wet hands could use it quickly. Most importantly, it was designed to measure just one thing with absolute precision: the angle of the sun or a star above the horizon. Why did that matter? Because if you knew the angle of the sun at noon, you could calculate your latitude, your position north or south of the equator. And if you knew your latitude, you were no longer lost. You could sail confidently along a specific parallel, knowing exactly how far north or south you were, even if you were 1,000 miles from the nearest coastline. This was revolutionary. For the first time in human history, sailors could venture into the open ocean and know where they were. They could leave Europe, sail south along the African coast, and return home safely, all without ever seeing land for weeks at a time. But the astrolabe was just one piece of the puzzle. Portugal didn't just adopt this technology, they systematically weaponized it, turning navigation from an art into a science. And the man behind this transformation was one of history's most fascinating and misunderstood figures. Let me introduce you to Prince Henry the Navigator, a man who never actually sailed on any of the great voyages of discovery, yet became the architect of Portugal's maritime empire. Born in 1394, Henry was the third son of King John I of Portugal. He wasn't going to inherit the throne, so he needed another purpose, another legacy, and he found it in the ocean. Henry was obsessed, and I mean genuinely obsessed, with pushing the boundaries of the known world. But unlike other explorers who grabbed a ship and set sail themselves, Henry was a strategist, an organizer, a visionary who understood that exploration required more than just courage. It required knowledge, technology, infrastructure, and most importantly, a systematic approach. Around 1420, Henry established what was essentially the world's first research and development center for maritime exploration at Sagres, on the southwestern tip of Portugal. Imagine a medieval version of NASA or MIT, a place where the best minds of the age gathered to solve one problem: how to sail farther, faster, and more accurately than anyone had before. Henry recruited astronomers, cartographers, shipbuilders, and experienced sailors from all over Europe and the Islamic world. He brought in Jewish mathematicians who understood trigonometry and geometry. He hired Arab navigators who had experience sailing the Indian Ocean. He commissioned Italian cartographers who could create accurate charts. This was a brain trust, a think tank centuries before those concepts existed. At Sagres, these experts worked together to improve every aspect of ocean navigation. They refined the design of the caravel, a revolutionary ship that could sail against the wind, something that Mediterranean galleys couldn't do. They studied wind patterns and ocean currents. They collected reports from every expedition and compiled them into detailed logs called rutters, which were essentially early sailing directions. But most importantly, they perfected the use of the astrolabe for maritime navigation. Henry's astronomers created detailed tables showing the position of the sun throughout the year at different latitudes. They developed techniques for using the North Star to determine position at night. They experimented with different methods of measuring angles at sea, eventually settling on the astrolabe as the most reliable tool. Henry understood something profound. Information was power. Every ship that left Portugal carried instructions to record everything: water depths, wind directions, coastal features, the positions of stars. When they returned, all that data was collected, analyzed, and compiled into master charts and sailing directions that were kept as state secrets. This wasn't just exploration for exploration's sake. Henry had specific goals. He wanted to find a sea route to the gold-producing regions of West Africa, cutting out the North African middlemen who controlled the trans-Saharan trade routes. He wanted to discover the legendary Christian kingdom of Prester John, supposedly somewhere in Africa or Asia, as a potential ally against Muslim powers. And ultimately, he wanted to find a sea route to India and the lucrative spice trade that made Venice and Genoa rich. Year after year, Henry sent expeditions farther and farther down the African coast. Each voyage built on the knowledge of the last. Each captain brought back new information that was added to Portugal's growing database of navigational intelligence. It was slow, methodical, and incredibly effective. Henry died in 1460, but his legacy lived on. The system he created, the ships, the instruments, the knowledge base, the culture of scientific exploration, became Portugal's greatest weapon, and soon Portuguese navigators would use that weapon to achieve the impossible. Okay, let's get into the nitty-gritty. How did this brass disc actually help sailors navigate across thousands of miles of empty ocean? The science is actually pretty elegant once you understand it. The basic principle is this: the position of the sun or stars in the sky changes depending on where you are on Earth. If you're at the equator, the sun passes directly overhead at noon. If you're at the North Pole, the sun stays low on the horizon even in summer. By measuring the angle of the sun or a star above the horizon, you can calculate your latitude, your distance north or south of the equator. Here's how a sailor would use a mariner's astrolabe. First, he'd wait for local noon, when the sun reached its highest point in the sky. Timing this was crucial, so navigators would start taking measurements a bit before noon and continue until the sun started descending again, noting the maximum altitude. The sailor would hold the astrolabe by a ring at the top, letting it hang freely, so gravity kept it vertical. The instrument had a rotating arm called an alidade, which had small sights on each end, kind of like the sights on a rifle. The navigator would rotate this arm until he could see the sun through both sights, essentially aiming the astrolabe at the sun. Now, here's the clever part. The astrolabe was marked with degrees from 0 to 90. Once the sun was aligned with the sights, the navigator could read the angle directly from the markings where the alidade pointed. This gave him the sun's altitude, its angle above the horizon. But that's just raw data. To convert that angle into latitude, navigators used astronomical tables called regiment of the sun or declination tables. These tables, painstakingly calculated by astronomers, showed the sun's declination, its angle relative to the celestial equator, for every day of the year. Let me give you an example. Say a Portuguese navigator is sailing down the African coast in March, and he measures the sun's altitude at noon as 60 degrees. He consults his declination table and sees that on this particular day in March, the sun's declination is, say, 5 degrees north. Using a simple calculation, which I'll spare you the details of, he determines his latitude is approximately 25 degrees north, roughly the latitude of the Canary Islands. Now he knows exactly how far south he's traveled. If his orders were to sail to a specific latitude and then turn east to reach a particular destination, he could do that with confidence. He didn't need to see land. He didn't need to guess. The math told him exactly where he was. At night, navigators could use the same technique with the North Star, which was even easier because the North Star's altitude directly equals your latitude in the Northern Hemisphere. If the North Star is 40 degrees above the horizon, you're at 40 degrees north latitude. Simple as that. Now, I should mention that the Astrolabe had limitations. It could only tell you latitude, not longitude, your east-west position. Determining longitude at sea wouldn't be solved until the invention of accurate marine chronometers in the 18th century. So Portuguese navigators used a technique called latitude sailing. They'd sail north or south until they reached the latitude of their destination, then sail due east or west along that parallel until they hit land. It sounds crude, but it worked. And compared to the alternative, aimless wandering and hoping for the best, it was miraculous. The Astrolabe also required clear skies. Clouds, fog, or storms made it useless. And taking measurements from a moving, rocking ship required skill and practice. The margin of error could be several miles, especially in rough seas. But even with these limitations, the Astrolabe gave Portuguese sailors something no one else had: confidence. They knew they could venture into the unknown and find their way back. Let me tell you about one of the most important moments in the history of exploration, a moment that doesn't get nearly enough attention: the conquest of Cape Bojador. Cape Bojador is a headland on the West African coast in what's now Western Sahara. To us today, it's nothing special, just a rocky outcrop jutting into the Atlantic. But to medieval Europeans, Cape Bojador was the end of the navigable world, a point of absolute terror that no Christian sailor had ever passed and returned from. Why was everyone so afraid of this particular spot? The Cape was surrounded by legends and very real dangers. The waters around Bojador are shallow and treacherous, full of reefs and powerful currents. The prevailing winds blow from the north, and the ocean swells are massive, making it nearly impossible to turn back once you pass the Cape using the technology of the time. Medieval sailors believed that beyond Bojador, the sea became so hot it would boil, that the sun's heat would turn your skin black, that sea monsters lurked in the depths. Maps literally labeled the region beyond Bojador as uninhabitable, deadly, a place where Christian ships went to die. For context, by the early 1430s, Portuguese expeditions had been trying to pass Cape Bojador for over a decade. Prince Henry the Navigator sent expedition after expedition, and every single one turned back before reaching the Cape. The sailors would get close, see the violent waters and inhospitable coast, remember all the terrifying legends, and nope, out of there as fast as their ships could carry them. Henry was furious. He knew these fears were largely superstitious nonsense, but he couldn't convince his sailors to push through. Imagine the frustration. You've invested years and massive amounts of money into developing new ships and navigation techniques, and your crews keep chickening out at the same spot every single time. Then, in 1434, Henry sent a young esquire named Gil Inez with explicit orders: pass Cape Bojador or don't bother coming back. This was essentially a succeed or you're done ultimatum. Inez's first attempt failed. He turned back like everyone else. But when he returned to Portugal and faced Henry's disappointment, something changed. Henry gave him another ship and another chance, this time with detailed instructions and, crucially, better navigational tools, including improved astrolabes and charts based on astronomical measurements. In 1434, Gil Inez set out again. This time, instead of hugging the coast and getting caught in the dangerous shoals, he used his navigational instruments to sail well out to sea, away from the coast. He used the astrolabe to maintain his latitude, sailing parallel to the coast but safely offshore, where the waters were deeper and the currents less treacherous. And then he did it. He sailed past Cape Bojador, the supposedly impassable barrier, and kept going. He found that the sea didn't boil, the sun didn't kill him. There were no monsters, just more coastline, more ocean, and most importantly, a route that could be safely navigated using the new Portuguese techniques. When Eanes returned to Portugal, he brought proof. Plants from beyond the Cape, evidence that the land was habitable and most valuable of all, detailed navigational information about wind patterns, currents, and the precise latitude of the Cape. This might seem like a small thing, one guy sailing past one scary cape. But psychologically and strategically it was enormous. Cape Bojador had been a mental barrier, a wall that said, the unknown is impassable. Gil Eanes proved that with the right tools and techniques, the unknown could be conquered. After 1434, Portuguese expeditions exploded down the African coast. Now that the psychological barrier was broken and the navigational methods proven, captains competed to see who could go farthest. Within a decade, they'd reached Senegal. Within 2 decades, they'd reached Sierra Leone. The West African gold trade that Portugal had dreamed of was now within reach, and it all started with the courage to sail past one terrifying cape using a brass instrument and some astronomical tables. Now let's jump forward to 1497 and talk about the voyage that proved Portugal's navigational revolution wasn't just effective, it was world-changing. I'm talking about Vasco da Gama's journey to India, one of the most audacious feats of exploration in human history. By the 1490s, Portuguese explorers had reached the southern tip of Africa. Bartolomeu Dias had rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488, proving that the Atlantic and Indian Oceans were connected. But reaching India by sea, that was the ultimate prize. The spice trade was the most lucrative business in the world, and Venice and Genoa controlled it through Middle Eastern intermediaries. If Portugal could establish a direct sea route to India, they'd become fabulously wealthy and break the Italian monopoly. King Manuel Verne of Portugal gave this mission to Vasco da Gama, a nobleman and experienced navigator who had the reputation of being tough, capable, and absolutely ruthless when necessary. In July 1497, da Gama left Lisbon with 4 ships and about 170 men. Their destination, Calicut, on the southwest coast of India, over 6,000 miles away by sea. Here's what made this voyage almost impossibly difficult. Most of it was through waters no European had ever sailed. Once they rounded the Cape of Good Hope, they'd be in the Indian Ocean, with no European charts, no familiar stars in some parts of the sky, and no idea what they'd encounter. But da Gama had something his predecessors didn't: decades of accumulated Portuguese navigational knowledge. He carried multiple astrolabes, detailed astronomical tables, charts of the African coast compiled from dozens of previous expeditions, and most importantly, rutters, detailed sailing directions that told him which latitudes to follow, when to expect certain wind patterns, and where fresh water could be found. The voyage was brutal. Scurvy ravaged the crew. By the time they reached India, over half the men were dead or dying. They faced storms, hostile encounters with African coastal rulers, and the constant terror of being lost at sea thousands of miles from home. But here's the remarkable thing: they were never truly lost. Even in the middle of the Indian Ocean, da Gama knew where he was. He used the astrolabe daily, taking measurements and calculating his position. When they reached the African coast, they could verify their latitude against the rutters and know exactly which part of the coast they'd reached. When they finally crossed to India and reached Calicut in May 1498, it was a triumph of navigation as much as courage. Da Gama had just completed a voyage of over 24,000 miles round trip, the longest ocean voyage ever undertaken up to that point. And he'd done it using instruments and techniques that had been refined over 70 years of Portuguese exploration. Now I should mention that da Gama's dealings in India were problematic. He was arrogant, violent, and made enemies quickly. The trade mission wasn't immediately successful, but the navigation was flawless. He'd proven that India could be reached by sea, that the route was navigable, and that with proper instruments and knowledge, European ships could sail anywhere in the world. When da Gama returned to Portugal in 1499, he was celebrated as a hero. More importantly, he brought back detailed navigational data about the Indian Ocean, wind patterns, currents, the positions of ports, and astronomical information that would make future voyages easier. Within a few years, Portuguese fleets were regularly sailing to India. Within a decade, Portugal had established a chain of fortified trading posts around the Indian Ocean. Within a generation, Portugal controlled the spice trade, built an empire stretching from Brazil to Japan, and became one of the wealthiest nations in Europe. And it all started with a brass disc that could measure the angle of the sun. The astrolabe was incredible, but it wasn't Portugal's only secret weapon. The Portuguese understood that domination of the seas required a complete system of navigation, and they developed or refined several tools that worked together to give them an overwhelming advantage. Let's talk about rutters first. The word comes from the French routier, meaning route or itinerary. Rutters were essentially detailed sailing directions compiled from the experiences of countless voyages. They told you which latitude to follow, what landmarks to look for, where dangers lurked, when you'd encounter trade winds, where you could find fresh water, and dozens of other crucial details. These weren't casual notes. They were carefully maintained state secrets. Portugal treated rutters like classified military intelligence. Captains were forbidden to show them to foreigners. Copies were kept in royal archives under guard. If a ship was in danger of being captured by enemies, orders were to throw the rutters overboard rather than let them fall into enemy hands. Why so secretive? Because rutters contained decades of hard-won knowledge. They told you that if you sailed to 28 degrees north latitude and headed west, you'd catch favorable winds to the Caribbean. They told you exactly where fresh water sources were on the African coast. They contained information that Portuguese sailors had literally died to obtain. Then there was the cross staff, also called the Jacob's staff. This was another angle measuring device, simpler than the astrolabe, but sometimes more practical at sea. It was basically a long wooden staff with a sliding crosspiece. You'd hold one end to your eye, slide the crosspiece until it bridged the angle between the horizon and a star or the sun, then read the angle from markings on the staff. It was faster than an astrolabe and worked well in rough conditions. Portuguese navigators also used lead lines for measuring water depth, vital when approaching coasts. The bottom of the lead was hollowed out and filled with tallow, animal fat, which would pick up samples of the sea bottom, sand, mud, shells, whatever. Experienced sailors could identify specific locations just by feeling and smelling these samples. It sounds crazy, but it worked. A navigator might say, "This is black mud with shell fragments. We're approaching Lisbon." Portugal also developed better charts. The Portolan charts of the Mediterranean were good for short distances, but they didn't account for the Earth's curvature or changing magnetic declination. Portuguese cartographers, working with mathematicians, developed more accurate charts that incorporated latitude scales and were based on astronomical observations rather than just compass bearings. And here's where things get really interesting: maritime espionage. Portugal's navigational secrets were so valuable that other nations desperately wanted them. Spain, England, France, and the Netherlands all tried to steal Portuguese rutters, charts, and instruments. Some succeeded. There are documented cases of Portuguese pilots being bribed or kidnapped to work for other nations. Spain's early explorations to the Americas relied heavily on Portuguese pilots who'd defected or been captured. When Ferdinand Magellan circumnavigated the globe for Spain, guess what? He was Portuguese, trained in Portugal's navigational methods, and he took Portuguese charts with him. Portugal tried to maintain their monopoly through a combination of secrecy, monopolizing key instrument makers, and establishing the Casa de India, a royal institution that controlled all information about overseas voyages. But ultimately, you can't keep secrets forever. By the mid-1500s, other European nations had caught up, and the age of discovery truly became global. Still, for a crucial century, Portugal's systematic approach to navigation, combining astrolabes, rutters, improved ship design, and carefully hoarded knowledge, gave them an edge that allowed a nation of barely 1 million people to build a maritime empire spanning 3 continents. Let's zoom out and look at the big picture. What did Portugal actually accomplish with their navigational revolution? The answer is staggering. Between 1415 and 1550, Portugal went from being a relatively poor kingdom on Europe's fringe to controlling the most extensive maritime empire the world had ever seen. And it was all enabled by their ability to navigate accurately across vast distances. In Africa, Portugal established a chain of trading posts and fortresses from Morocco to Mozambique. They bypassed the trans-Saharan trade routes and dealt directly with West African kingdoms for gold, ivory, and unfortunately, slaves. The Portuguese were the first Europeans to establish a large-scale Atlantic slave trade, a horrific legacy that cannot be ignored. Their navigational technology, which was such a triumph of human ingenuity, also enabled one of humanity's greatest crimes. In Asia, Portugal was even more ambitious. After Vasco da Gama's voyage, the Portuguese moved fast. They conquered Goa in India, Malacca in Malaysia, and Hormuz in the Persian Gulf, strategic ports that controlled key trade routes. They established a presence in China, at Macau, and became the first Europeans to trade directly with Japan. The Portuguese Estado da India, their Indian Ocean Empire, was a network of fortified trading posts connected by sea power and maintained through superior navigation. A Portuguese ship could sail from Lisbon around Africa, across the Indian Ocean to Goa, then to Malacca, then to Macau, and back again, all while knowing their position and following established routes recorded in their precious rutters. And then there was Brazil. In 1500, Pedro Álvares Cabral, sailing to India, swung far west into the Atlantic, either to catch better winds or possibly because he already knew land was there. He discovered Brazil and claimed it for Portugal. Whether this was intentional or not, it showed the confidence Portuguese navigators had. They could sail thousands of miles off known routes, trusting their instruments to get them home. Brazil became Portugal's largest colony, a massive territory that eventually eclipsed Portugal itself in size and wealth. The entire colonization of Brazil was possible because Portuguese ships could reliably cross the Atlantic and back, year after year, fleet after fleet. At its peak around 1580, the Portuguese Empire touched 4 continents: Europe, Africa, Asia, and South America. It was sustained by perhaps 300 ships and a few thousand sailors, all relying on the navigational techniques pioneered in the early 1400s. But here's something crucial to understand. This wasn't just about one invention. The astrolabe was vital, but so were the ships, the rutters, the training, the organizational structure, and the culture of systematic exploration that Portugal created. They turned ocean navigation from a terrifying gamble into a repeatable science. Other nations learned from Portugal's example. Spain, using similar techniques, and often Portuguese pilots, conquered the Americas. England, France, and the Netherlands built their own maritime empires. The age of sail, which dominated global geopolitics for 3 centuries, was built on the foundation that Portugal laid. And it's worth noting that this technology had effects far beyond empire building. The ability to navigate accurately meant that maps became dramatically more accurate. Cartography flourished. For the first time, humans could create reasonably accurate world maps. The exchange of goods, ideas, and yes, diseases became global. The modern world, for better and worse, was born from the ability to cross oceans reliably. The astrolabe and the navigational revolution it represented literally reshaped the world. 3 continents were conquered, new trade routes were established, entire civilizations were destroyed or transformed, and the balance of global power shifted from land-based empires to maritime powers. All because Portugal figured out how to measure the angle of the sun from a rocking boat in the middle of the ocean. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the terror of the open ocean in medieval times to Portugal's systematic revolution in navigation, from Cape Bojador to the Indian Ocean, from a simple brass instrument to an empire spanning 3 continents. But here's the thing, history isn't just about the past, it's about understanding how human ingenuity solves impossible problems. It's about seeing how small innovations compound into world-changing transformations. The story of the astrolabe is really a story about how knowledge, determination, and systematic thinking can overcome seemingly insurmountable barriers. Now I want to hear from you. What do you think was the most important factor in Portugal's success? Was it the technology, the leadership of people like Prince Henry, the courage of individual explorers, or something else? Do you think the age of exploration was ultimately a positive or negative development for humanity? These are complex questions without easy answers. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and I love when these videos spark genuine discussion and debate. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into how the astrolabe changed the world, do me a favor. Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. We're building a community of people who love history that matters, stories that explain how we got to where we are today. Next time, we're going to explore another technology that changed everything. You won't want to miss it. Until then, keep learning, keep questioning, and remember, the tools we create don't just change what we can do. They change who we become. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.